Okay.
I'd like as best as you're comfortable and able to imagine that who's watching this is a typical American parent, to the extent you can use the word typical
Right.
of anything anymore, and school teacher who's not necessarily steeped in the science of economics or
Right.
kind of sociological metrics and what have you. That's your toolbox. So to try to be as translational in connecting the importance of your work as possible to in layman language.
Right. Okay.
I'd like to start off with having some background of, like we did on the phone, of kind of how you come into this, how you become such a champion of holding a certain standard up for research quality, and where you pointed your lenses and why. To help people understand where you're coming from and what biases you're willing to own, so to speak.
Okay.
As a backdrop, this will be helpful in the transcript
Sure.
and the more extended set. Then when we get to the things that we're really wanting to drill into, it's going to have to do with equity, accountability, and what's affecting student performance. And
Okay.
looping all the way back to Coleman and all the
Right.
way forward to the
Okay.
things that you're doing. So that's kind of a broad brush. Maybe we can begin then with how do you come to be here at the Hoover Institute, what you're doing, and the path of learning that led you to this.
Sure. I actually started thinking about schools long ago when I was doing a dissertation in economics, or looking for a dissertation. The original Coleman report was published. The original Coleman report turned out to be an amazing document, because it seemed to say that schools didn't matter and that only parents mattered in the education of children. We've subsequently found out that that's not the case, but it's been a long journey to figure out exactly why Coleman originally found that and why he didn't. But I started quite accidentally studying schools, but as I got into it, found that schools are very important for all kinds of reasons. I've looked mainly at the economic implications of schooling, and there we find that people who know more earn more. Nations that do better in school grow faster than other nations. And so the economic implications are just quite amazing and quite large. This is not to deny that there are other implications of schooling, but it is to say that even if we look quite narrowly at just the economic implications, the quality of our schools is extraordinarily important to us as a society and to us as individuals.
Seeing you brought up the Coleman report as a kind of a takeoff spot, and you say that we've learned quite a bit since then. I mean, my take, and back to our first phone conversation, was that I don't think it was the case that schools didn't matter. Like, schools are still the only thing that can make a difference in some ways, or the most important opportunity to make a difference, but that the relative size of effect on student performance was the issue, yes?
That's part of it. I mean, there were two things about the original Coleman report. First, it said that overwhelmingly parents were the most important determinant of achievement. Now, there's truth to the extent that parents are very important in learning of children. People then, though, went on to say that this did not, that schools didn't have much to do, couldn't overcome much of these differences. That was the part that is now, I think, overstated at the time. What we found is that schools make a difference, and a large difference. It is just that schools are not measured by the kinds of things that Coleman thought were used to define schools. A good school was not necessarily the one that spent the most. A good teacher was not necessarily the one who had a master's degree or the most experience. What we found was that there are big differences across schools. They just aren't closely related to our common ways to judge the quality of schools.
Let's speak to some of that as that segues us in. So some of your work has been on class size and teacher quality with various attributes or ways of describing that and its effect on student performance. What is making the difference?
Well, I think what we now have come to understand is that the quality of teachers is absolutely essential, and that the quality of teachers has a huge impact on student achievement. But quality of teachers is hard to measure. People want to measure it in simple terms. They want to measure it by the backgrounds of teachers or some of the other easily observed characteristics. It turns out that those characteristics are not very good measures of the quality of teachers. When I use the term quality of teachers, I mean a person who can, year after year, get higher rates of achievement out of her students than another teacher. And we find that there are some teachers who can get high rates of learning out of their students each and every year. There are also some teachers, on the other end, that get low rates of learning out of their teachers. Teacher quality, to me, is the ability to get more achievement out of students, more learning.
As indicated by various assessment mechanisms that we're employing to tell us how students are doing.
Yes, right now we are getting much better at measuring what students know at each point in time. What you want to look at is how fast does that knowledge that students have increase over time. So we look at some student who starts the fourth grade a little bit behind. Do they end up at the end of the fourth grade still a little bit behind, or do they end up farther ahead than they started? That's the importance of teachers, in my opinion.
You see the shift in the probable trajectories. You see the performance increase in a way that you can really correlate with the teacher rather than the other variables.
Yes. Now, behind all of my statements about teacher quality are a lot of complicated statistical analyses that are designed to make sure that we know it's the teacher and not some other characteristics of just who's in the classroom. Thus, we look at the same teacher with different groups of students and see if she consistently gets achievement even if she has different groups of students. And we also look at individual students and see whether they learn more with some people than with others. By looking at those two things, we can narrow it down to the impact of teachers as opposed to the impacts of the students themselves. Are we getting too complicated for your story?
No. That's why I think we're doing really well. This kind of hooks back to where we began before we began in California and the dismal performance in some areas. In that you're not speaking from a ungrounded theory. You're not a philosopher. You're dealing with data sets and highly refined scientific methodologies for mining that data to come to hypotheses and conclusions about it that feed into your opinions that you're sharing now in a way that is different than the teacher opinions that get bandied about out there.
Absolutely. Much of educational research involves people going into classrooms and trying to sort out what the teacher is doing and what the students are doing, and to make judgments from the observations in individual classrooms. That's valuable, but we've had problems generalizing that to all of the teachers that we see. The work that I've done has taken regularly available information about the reading and math and science abilities of individual students and try to look broadly at what factors lead some kids to learn more and some kids to learn less. Now, as I said, we know that parents are very important, but we have now come to realize that high-quality schools also can, in fact, make up for deficiencies that children bring to the classroom.
Right. This is an important point. Now, there's a difference between can schools make a difference in helping to compensate and equalize these varied backgrounds and disadvantages that children are coming from. One dimension, it seems, as distinct from what is the relative effect of on learning, on student performance of a child's life outside of school and the child's life inside of school. And my understanding from others is that it's still predominantly, the student performance is still predominantly the effects of what's going on outside of school, but that school is where the great opportunity is to make a difference that equalizes the opportunity. I'm just going to put words in you. I'm giving you a framework.
No, sure. And absolutely. Parents prepare children at different rates. So some kids come to school much less prepared than other kids. It turns out to be highly correlated with the socioeconomic backgrounds of the parents. And that is one of the things that we hope as a society to deal with. How can we, in fact, deal with the differential backgrounds and overcome the fact that some kids get a bad draw in terms of the knowledge that they're getting from their parents. Now, what we found is that there is enough leverage in schools to change and alter where children are, even if they come less prepared to schools. Part of the problem, though, we have is that schools don't systematically make sure that there are always top-rate teachers available to every child. Schools provide a really good teacher one year, and then the next year may go just the opposite way, so that we don't always add up to a set of schooling experiences that overcome the background differences.
Right.
Let me ask you one thing. There's a washing machine that's sort of going on in the background. Is that going to cause you problems? Are you going to pick that up or not?
I'm not picking it up.
Okay. It's actually not going very loudly now.
The microphone has incredible sensitivity in a very small volume.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to make sure that.
I appreciate your sensitivity. One of the things that, of course, we're really interested in is the relationship between literacy, learning to read, and how that affects learning in general, how it affects attitudes about learning, emotional frustration tolerance, you might say, for hanging in frustration and confusion and so forth. And it certainly seems as if, from research from the neurosciences and linguistics and from early childhood development, people like Shankov's work and so forth, that there's a certain trajectory of developmental readiness that if a child's not in that stream, so to speak, when they hit the kind of confusions that they hit in the first grade, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, that they can get in trouble in a way that not only knocks them out of sync with where the curriculum wants to go, but knocks them out of sync with themselves in a really deep way. So there's this critical window on the very front end of education where it seems necessary to be able to assess and meet and kind of read where children are at and meet them with the scaffolding they need to get them up into this thing before they're on a negative trajectory. How does your work kind of light up that space, if any?
Well, the work I've done has tried to look at the growth patterns of students and how you change their trajectory of learning. what we know is that children come to school at the very earliest part of school in kindergarten, first grade, with huge differences in terms of their background and learning. We know that the vocabularies are very different among students. And again, it's associated often with the education and background of the parents. When we go through the early reading years and get into the tougher business of comprehension of reading materials and how fast can we read complicated materials and how much of it can we understand, we see that it's very important to be prepared at that point. That's the point where the mathematics curriculum starts to take off, the social studies curriculum starts to take off, the science curriculum. And if students aren't prepared in their reading abilities and their comprehension abilities, they fall back in all areas. That's what we see, is that when I look at the data on performance later on in schools, as they get into secondary schools, all of these scores are very highly correlated for any individual. People who read well know more science, they know more mathematics. Part of that might be just innate ability, but part of it is the ability to build upon what you know and to get to a new point.
And your confidence in learning and your frustration tolerance for confusion.
Yeah, when you get into the psychological, you're getting beyond me. So you have many better people to speak about that.
I appreciate you staying on your ground. That's good. That's good. So, kind of summarizing this point, you do see, clear correspondence between, like others, but you're bringing your perspective, your lens, between how well somebody's reading as they come into these more complex areas of the curriculum and how well the rest of their school unfolds.
Absolutely, absolutely. All these matter, but the ability to pick up a textbook in any area and figure it out relies upon having high levels of comprehension. And comprehension also relies upon having high levels of knowledge in general, knowledge of history, knowledge of politics and society around. And I think that we're finding that just basic comprehension requires lots of basic knowledge. So it all fits together. At the end, when I look at it, the package counts. The package counts in terms of the ability to earn more in the labor market, to go on further in schooling, to do innovative things. All seems to be closely related.
So that goes back to, so there's a correspondence between reading, student performance in general, worker skills, and lifelong economic opportunity.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that economists have looked at in great detail is how skills differ across individuals and how they're rewarded in the labor market. Economists have spent a lot of time thinking about how much schooling somebody has. Recently, we found that how good the schooling is also very, very important. As we've started to measure the quality of what people know, how much they comprehend and how much they know, we find that that's highly related to performance in the labor market.
I level because I'm at a little bit of an altitude. Am I really
That's
check on
good, and I got that last thing before
Yesterday we gave a presentation at the Literacy Initiative in Oakland, in a church, with people representing the American community and people of great disadvantage. They're trying to create some kind of renewed mission and light a fire there about literacy and its importance. And there's a lot of people in that community, as we started to share certain ideas, that have a sense that the mainstream research informing governmental policy about education's direction seems to be insensitive to them. I know it's a big generalization to just hurl out, but in reflecting on your work, what I know of it, which I don't profess to be a great deal, you seem to have been and to be championing the equity issues, trying to help people understand, of course, what this data is saying about what works and what doesn't, about accountability, and how that's radiating to create beneficial compensation for different disadvantaged groups. So let's take a moment, that's somewhat complex segue, and unpack a little bit the role of education in creating more equal opportunity for children, regardless of their backgrounds, and what your work has brought to light about what is making a difference and what's not there.
Well, throughout my entire academic career, I've been concerned with a variety of distributional issues. Why is it that black students and black workers do worse than whites on average? What is it, and what are we doing to try to take care of that? We know that with a lot of concern about the distribution of income in society, that's closely related to the skills that we've given workers over their lifetime. If we want to do something about making more equal the outcomes in our society, I think we have to concentrate on the skills that we provide people. We know from the economics of it that just giving money to people when they don't have as much money doesn't always solve the problem. It doesn't lead to long-run solutions that both lead to better operation of the economy and that lead to more equitable outcomes. Therefore, we concentrate on the skills.
Very much the Chinese proverb, rather teach them how to fish than give them a fish.
That's precisely it. That's precisely the idea. And you know, our society has done well by rewarding people for the skills and work they have. That has led to the great accomplishments of the U.S. economy. Luckily, it's only 2 o'clock. Many of the accomplishments of the U.S. economy can be traced directly back to the skills of the U.S. workers and the ability to innovate, to introduce new technology, to increase productivity over time. So that we don't want to, in fact, deal with equity issues in ways that also harm the overall outcomes of the economy. That's why back in the Lyndon Johnson presidency, we thought of the war on poverty not as giving more money to people in poverty, but solving poverty by, in fact, changing the skills and the abilities of the people in the economy. Those arguments, I think, were right. At the same time, we haven't done a very good job of making sure that we equalize the opportunities and skills that are given. Part of that relates, I think, to some problems we have in the overall debate about how to improve our schools. Much of the debate about equalizing skills in the quality of schooling has come down to, are we spending as much in this school as we are in that school? Somehow, people believe that if we spend exactly the same amount, we've equalized the opportunities and skills. The research we've done over a long period of time shows that that's not a good measure. Surely we need some minimal amounts of resources and spending on schools, and we want to make sure that we provide the best opportunities. But just providing the money has not worked very well at providing the high-quality schools that we need. So when we go to inner cities, the debate over whether we should spend more money or not may be important at some point, but there's a prior debate. There's a prior debate about how we make sure we have the very best high-quality teachers in these schools, and that's not always related to how much we spend per student.
So at the bottom, it says like we need to be in a dialogue towards a better scientific consensus that more people in education understand about what is the criteria that we're using to understand how to wisely spend our resources.
Yes, we have to worry about how we wisely spend our resources. We're making a lot of progress in at least setting the right background for these questions. We have now started to provide detailed information about the performance of students. In my book, if we want to talk about equity and equalized opportunities, we should always focus on what the distribution of learning is, what people know, and what, say, the black students in Oakland know compared to the white students in Oakland or in Berkeley. And that should be the focus. Once we have established that, or have agreement on that, then we can get down to the business of making them more equal and figuring out how to improve our schools and provide the resources and background that in fact lead to equalizing the outcomes. It's been a long time getting to the point where we can talk about equity in terms of the things we care about, and that's what students know.
Yeah, at some point in our conversation, I want to talk about the relationship between knowing and learning. It's just
Right.
really close to the heart at one level of this conversation. Here, what you just said, I mean, the sense that I get from a lot of people that we talk to, both out in the world, teachers and parents, but also other experts, is that we don't have a common set of attributes, a common set of criteria from which to agree that these are the important things that we should be watching, tracking, working to improve, and so forth. And then in the absence of that, it's like, where's the fulcrum? Where's the levers?
Mm.
We're spending a lot of energy pushing and pulling different edges of the water balloon.
Right. Well, the dilemma that often is faced by policymakers and parents and other decision makers is how do we ensure high quality schools, and how do we measure them? How do we know when we've achieved something? The problem from my standpoint is that once we've said we want high quality schools, we immediately go to very simplistic measures of the resources available in schools. We look at what the class sizes are. We look at what the teachers are paid. We look at the degrees of teachers. Unfortunately, these are bad metrics. They're bad ways to measure quality. The research that we have shows that none of these, as much as we'd all like to believe it, none of these are very closely related to student performance. Therefore, when we go too quickly into the debate about these issues, we lose sight of the fact that we're really concerned about what the students know and their student outcomes.
That was beautiful. That was a jewel from start to finish. That was really, really important and well said. Thank you. That's paralleling what I'm driving at in my questions, which is that we almost have to demythologize our general society sense of what it is that makes the difference, and learn to come to a new top 10 list or top 20
Right.
list of what we think is important. And right now that's still in the fog, and it's people like yourself whose work is bringing that up to attention and illuminating it with a certain quality of scientific rigor that makes it less arguable than all the general fuzzies.
Right. Well, let me see if I can respond to that.
One of the things you can do is say, as briefly as you can, or as elaborate as you care to, what are, if it's not the class size, and it's not the degrees of the teacher, and it's not how many dollars per student is being allocated, what is it?
Well, partly people throw up their hands because they say, if you can't tell me precisely what it is, what can we do about it? The answer is we can't say precisely what it is. We know that there are some great teachers who are just starting out and don't have master's degrees or much experience. And we know that there are some great teachers who have lots of experience and master's degrees. We also know the opposite, that there are some very poor teachers in both of those situations. I think part of the problem is that everybody is looking for an answer that is much simpler than reality. The reality is that teaching is a very complicated business, and classroom instruction and learning, the interaction between the teachers and students, is a very complicated business. In order to get some level of learning out of students, many teachers approach it in very different ways. And I think that our research methods are currently, at least, incapable of sorting out the various ways in which learning goes on in classrooms and the characteristics that are important. Another way of looking at this is that many people can achieve the same results from very different avenues and with very different backgrounds of the teachers. Our research is looking for these small number of ways that always lead or consistently lead to better performance. And it hasn't allowed for the complexity of what actually goes on. Some people compensate for less subject matter knowledge by, say, more preparation and better presentation of materials. Other people don't think much about preparation because they have the background in subject matter knowledge and they just go in and wing it. And in both cases, you can have very good learning going on. You can also have dreadful learning when somebody is unprepared or doesn't know their subject matter. And it's very hard to pick out the single elements that add up to a good teacher and think of adding up what we need. Now, the real problem with that causes is developing policies that are based upon ensuring that certain characteristics are met. When we certify teachers, we have a list of backgrounds and attributes that they should have in order to be a good teacher, or at least an acceptable teacher. If we don't have a good idea of exactly what are the components of being a good teacher, we have trouble writing the rules and regulations about who should be teachers in that way. Now, The Economist has a different perspective on much of this. The Economist would say, let's define what we want to achieve, what our measure of knowledge and learning is, and then we will reward more of that, and we will maybe penalize less of that. Teachers that are able to get more learning in their classrooms should be rewarded or provided incentives to do that, to stay in teaching. Teachers who cannot get the levels of achievement and outcomes in students that we care about should not be encouraged. We should not have incentives for them to stay in teaching, but we should have incentives for them to do other things where they might be more productive.
That makes perfect sense at a high-level policy level. I mean, it sounds like it's a kind of black boxing it. You're saying, look, inside this box, I'm not telling you what to do.
Right.
But your box has got to be this productive.
Right.
If it's not this productive, then we're going to consider that your box isn't working very well, and you should
Right.
put your box somewhere else.
Right.
Right? So it's a black box model. In and of itself, that creates a motivational pressure on the teacher to have a better box, but it's not informing them in the same way about how to vary their practice or learn their way to be more effective. That has to come from another angle.
To be sure. I mean, how teachers get to be good at this is a little bit unclear. We have some bits and pieces from research that others have done. It's not in my area, but others have looked at the effects of varying curricula on learning. Others have looked at the effects of different amounts of subject matter, different pedagogy. All of these things have their part in helping people to be good at this business of teaching. Well, let me just add a couple quick things, and that is we have not been very good at getting the universal truths in each of these areas, the things that always work and always indicate failure if you don't have them. And so that's been a problem, but that's partly why the economist is more happy with the black box, because if somebody can in fact do well without having all of this background, fine, we'll let them do it. Others may be helped by getting some of this material and may become good teachers. We don't know, I should say, in my opinion, how malleable anybody is in teaching. I think that there's very imperfect information about whether we can take anybody and make them into a high-quality teacher with the right professional development, with the right pre-service training. We don't have that information now about how malleable people are. And so I don't want to lean on that as much as I would like to also be more serious about the selection of teachers. One view of providing incentives is always that we make these teachers work harder, make them put in more effort, make them do things differently. But there's another view of the incentives we're talking about, and that is we want to use incentives to encourage the good people to stay in teaching, to continue doing well. And we want to discourage the others who aren't doing well for one reason or another. Either they don't have the right background and training, or they don't have the right traits to, in fact, do this complicated job.
Which again, at a high-level system view, makes an awful lot of sense as far as getting the boxes to work better. And from the people in the boxes, there's this rebellion against what seems like the draconian robot factory. You know, there's all the complaints that go with that. The difficulty, it would seem, is that the high-level system view of improvement doesn't connect to the lower level teacher training, teacher development track
Sure.
well enough for the two systems to talk and dialogue and learn together forward. Have you encountered Haberman's work?
Only a little bit. I'm not as
right.
So I'd rather not speak on that.
No,
I've seen a little bit of that. There's as I understand it, the evidence is not completely clear on. He has these different selection devices, right? And the evidence relating that to actual performance, I think, is less clear than we'd like it.
I'm not an advocate for him or other people that we've talked to, but one of the things that does seem to have come up is a remarkable parallel between the kind of engagement, language engagement that children get early and how well they take off in reading. In other words, there's a certain way that parents relate to children that seems to be very helpful in getting them up on the road, and that there's a number of people that have studied teacher behaviors and found it's basically the same behaviors, which is, are you meaningfully engaging the child and supporting them while you're pulling them into greater complexity, you know, helping them learn how to participate rather than broadcasting at them.
Yeah. Well, most of it is getting a little bit more detailed on the black box. We try to stay away from the black box.
And I appreciate that. We want all these perspectives. We want to be able to go from the black box to the quantum probabilities inside of it. You know?
Well, I mean, it is entirely clear that this large overview of different incentives does, in fact, conflict with the views of lots of people in the schools currently. There are some people in the schools currently that are doing an extraordinary job, and that we want to keep there. There's some other people in the schools currently that are not doing as well, and their perspectives on whether we should reward performance or not are probably different.
Yeah, they're the ones that, as we encounter, that are quick to say, well, you know, it's a bell curve, and a lot of kids just aren't going to make it.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And I need my insurance.
And, that's one of the things Haverman's really good at, is talking about all the incentives that support teachers not being good teachers.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm very happy with our conversation so far. One of the things that I'd like to do, I want to come back to the knowledge and learning thing. Not that I think that's an area of your particular expertise or interest, but it's always, you know, it's always an interesting dialogue, but we'll kind of get that as we close. I want to give you a chance to say, you know, you have the microphone, the camera's on you, suppose that the educators and parents are watching. What is it they don't understand that you understand, that you think is really important to kind of understand education? Where's the gap as you see it from your perspective and your vantage in how the general population is not getting what makes the difference in education?
You got me. You got me, David. Let me think for a second. This is too big. You know, we economists are all small think, but I think one of the real problems that we have in making educational policy is that everybody has been through schools themselves. And lots of people have very strong opinions about what is making a difference and what doesn't. And then there's lots of very commonsensical kinds of ideas that tend to drive what we do in schools. The best example, of course, is the wars over class size reduction that we've had in the last 10 years or so. It's very commonsensical to believe that if you have smaller numbers of smaller classrooms, fewer kids in the classroom, that each kid will get more personalized attention, that the educational plan will be more closely aligned with each student. What is left out of discussions like that is to have smaller classes means that you have to have more teachers. And getting the right quality teachers to fit into those added classrooms takes a lot of work, and we haven't done that particularly well to date. In my opinion, if you have a class size reduction policy in some district, the impact of that will depend almost entirely on the quality of the new teachers that you hire. Whether class size reduction leads to more achievement or less achievement depends upon whether you get better than average teachers in the classroom or worse than average when you go out hiring. Parents and decision makers are happy with the idea that more attention is what counts, and don't pay attention to the fact that who's in the classroom may be different than you have before that. They also don't pay attention, as at least parents, to the fact that it costs a lot more money to have small classes. The economist would say if we're going to put more money into the system, what's the best way to do that? As opposed to, don't we necessarily have to have smaller classes? So if you took the same $150 or $200 million that California is putting into class size reduction and put it into incentive programs for teacher quality, you might get a much, much higher return on that investment of money.
That's so interesting. It's also revealing of a certain simplistic black boxing that's going on the part of parents and the public in general about this relationship between teachers and students, as if all teachers are equal, we just more boxes.
Do you want a little more controversy on this?
Sure.
I have a question too. Go ahead.
Okay, so one of the other complications that we have when we make educational policy is that the people we look to for the answers are also dependent upon what goes on in the schools. The teachers themselves are not indifferent to the way we run schools. Teachers, myself included, like to have fewer kids in any class. Why? Well, we might get more satisfaction out of knowing kids better, but we also know that our workload is less when we have fewer children in class. Thus, when we have these debates, the teachers, as the experts in how to do our instruction, come in and say, well, of course we have to have smaller classes. So that immediately leads to some conflicts between developing effective policies and meeting all of our objectives.
Excellent. I appreciate you timing in. There really is this, I would imagine that there's unless you're in presentation mode, that the smaller the group, the greater the opportunity for intimacy, for making more relevant connections. And yet, that's, from a teacher's perspective, a lot of good reasons why they'd want to have a smaller. Yet, from the society's point of view and wanting to spend its dollars and resources wisely, it seems to me that a really good teacher with a larger class would be better than two teachers with smaller classes who are ineffective.
Well, I'll give you the, parents often are asked, do you want smaller classes? I think that's the wrong question often for parents to ask. They should be asking, do we get the highest quality teacher? Because the highest quality teacher in a large class is often much, much better than a mediocre teacher in a small class.
Question?
Yeah, when you're talking about we might be better off spending our money kind of in developing the teacher quality programs or incentives and putting our money there instead of hiring more teachers. If we're not really sure how teachers get to be better teachers and we don't have this universal truth and we can say what doesn't really make a difference, but we can't really say what does. I'm not looking for a silver bullet here either. Then we'd have to measure the intelligence of who's running these teacher quality programs to come back and say, are they worth it? Are they working? Where are we coming from in ourselves if we can't define these characteristics to develop these teacher quality programs?
Well, there is a set of questions that relates to how we prepare our teachers. Right now, we standardly rely upon a set of schools of education that have traditionally done this, but yet we don't know how to link what they do to classroom performance very well. This has led to lots of recent questions about whether we should allow for alternative routes into teaching. My own view is that we should, in fact, loosen up a lot on who gets into teaching, but take much more seriously who gets to keep teaching. That we should pay a lot more attention to the retention of teachers than putting all of our eggs into how we train teachers. This is what happens in most professions in the United States today. We have many people training to be everything from accountants to lawyers to other kinds of managerial positions. Many people start out in an occupation and change. In fact, we often hear cries that we have such high turnover rates in teaching that there must be something wrong and we must be doing something bad. It turns out that the turnover rates of teaching are about the same as the turnover rates in other professions at the beginning of their jobs. It's just that it's a national crisis when it refers to teaching, and it's not when it refers to other occupations.
Really helpful.
I'm sure. I've tried to help your editing out.
So I think as we close, I want to give you another chance to reflect on, is there something else that you think is some jewel that you're now aware of, that you weren't aware of, that the population as a whole is not aware of, that if they could get it would make a difference? That incubate a little bit.
Okay. Well, one thing that has become apparent from the study of education from an economist standpoint is its import for the well-being of society in general. We have found that this is extraordinarily important. There are many people who currently argue that the accountability systems we have now are all wrong because they emphasize these narrow things like skills on math and science tests. It turns out that these are just the skills that lead to differences in labor forces across countries that matter. It makes a difference whether the population knows more and knows more of the things we're measuring than not.
Yeah, we could do a table on that one. I read some of your work on that point. That's very important. Picking up on this and also circling back to something you said earlier about the historical relationship between worker skills and the economy, is that, when we talk about what was happening, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, there was a greater opportunity to become skilled in the workplace after school. In other words, the dependence on early learning, on literacy, on the early trajectory through school wasn't as important to how well somebody could fit into the economy and both help the economy and themselves. It seems that, over the past 30 years with the explosion of the computer, the information-based economy rather than the factory-based economy, that there's a dependence on a different kind of learning in the generations that come forward than there was in the generations behind.
Well, I'm not sure if it's a different kind of learning and a different learning trajectory. The economy as a whole demands much more skilled individuals today than it did in the past for just the ordinary jobs in society. It used to be that you didn't have to have even a high school education to have very high paid, productive jobs. But those jobs were very different than the jobs that are highly paid now. Today, there's a minimum level of skills that's required, even if you're doing assembly line jobs. People on assembly lines are calculating standard deviations and error tolerances in ways that in the past were not required. So there's been a change in the character of jobs and the demands that are there. At the same time, I think that the basic learning trajectories haven't changed that much. The people who were at the top in the past may not have all completed college education, but they were on an early learning trajectory that allowed them to learn new things, to comprehend new ideas, to read them in technical materials. Even though they were trained at a lower level, they were, I think, still learning much the same thing. But today, it is very hard to get away with just being a good guy who doesn't have the skills and the knowledge that is demanded today. There's a circular sense. So I'm not convinced that the learning per se is different. People stopped at an earlier age.
I guess what I mean by that is that whereas it may be true that there's certain characteristics of a learner that make for success in any age, having to do with, and that comes back to the question between knowledge and learning, which I want to explore. But relative to the low end and middle of our population in the socioeconomic, in the work skill space, there was a lot of room for somebody who had reading difficulties to still be successful in some other way. The average auto mechanic didn't have to be using a computer terminal or reading lots of books. There was a lot of ways to make money being intuitive, physical mechanic.
Yeah, so what I'm saying, I related that to people with different skills, having different positions in the economy at different points in time. But I think that the people who got to any of those skill levels were learning it in much the same way. It was just, we had a much more selective schooling system in the past than we do today. And we're trying to bring everybody along. I think that's, in fact, a good and important goal. I think that saying no child shall be left behind is good because it is setting expectations and standards that we as a society want to try to carry through on. We don't know completely how to do this, to make it happen, because we haven't ever succeeded at that. But having that as a goal out there changes expectations in very important ways, and it changes the way schools are operating.
Social moon mission.
Right, exactly. We didn't know that we could actually land somebody on the moon in the past, but we set that as a goal, and we made that. Now, there may be some other goals that we don't make, at least in the foreseeable future. We might not land somebody on Mars in the foreseeable future, even if we set that as a goal.
Yeah, well, we know for sure we won't if we don't set it as a goal.
That's right, precisely. Precisely.
Good. Well, absent any last reflections on your part, I would just say, relative to knowledge and learning, what you said a moment ago, we were talking about the overlap of what's happening on the people that are successful in one form or another. It seems to me that what differentiates the people, historically, scientists, inventors, people that have really made the difference in one form or another in their lives and in society, are people who are learning oriented. They were able to drive their own learning. It seems to me that what differentiates the people, historically, scientists, inventors, people that have really made the difference in one form or another in their lives and in society, are people who are learning oriented. They were able to drive their own learning where they were interested or needed to go and bootstrap that process into a trajectory that worked for them. And that whereas that includes and stands on knowledge, and knowledge is the fluid that's traveling through, it's not about knowledge per se.
Right. Well, economists have pondered a little bit why are more educated people paid less than, why are more educated people paid more than less educated people? Now, if you thought of somebody with a Ph.D., it is not at all obvious that they can put together parts more quickly than anybody else, or do any particular task faster than everybody else. The generally accepted view is that one of the important elements of education is allowing you to deal with new things, to adapt to different circumstances. That is what has that is a view of why it's so important to have an entirely educated population. If you want to introduce new technologies into an economy, you have to have workers who can adapt to these new technologies. New technologies is what leads to increased productivity and growth of national income and the wealth of the population. That's the common view of what is important about education. It's not that somebody knows the current science, because the current science might be wrong, but it's that somebody knows how to learn about new science and adapt. It's also how they learn to adapt to workplaces. 15 years ago, very few workplaces had any computers at all in them. Today, most workplaces have computers everywhere, and everybody from the CEO of a company on down to the lowest administrative staff uses computers. 15 years ago, that wasn't the case. How did we get there? Well, it wasn't that we taught these people how to use computers 20 years ago. It's that we taught them how to adapt to something different, how to learn to do something that they had never even thought about doing when they were in school. That's the key element.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, back in those days, I was an opponent of the emphasis on computer literacy on just that ground. My sense has always been that what you just described is the key to all of this, which means how is it that the fundamental intention of our education system is to use knowledge, skills, and experiences not just as the end, but as the means through which we're exercising how well somebody is able to participate and become self-extending in learning what they need to learn when they need to learn.
Yeah, right. Precisely.
And how do we now wrap our metrics around that? Because until that shift happens, we've got all these black boxes that are like Russian dolls, right?
Right. Well, I mean, many people believe that the reason why mathematics is so important is that it gives a structure to how people move from here to there, to an analytical structure. And as we talked about, you don't get to mathematics without being able to read and comprehend different materials. So it's all linked together. But it's the skill to go into new things that we hadn't seen before that seems particularly important. And that seems particularly important for the economy. There's been a little bit of a debate among economists of whether it's just training scientists and engineers that's important versus the entire labor force. That debate is not entirely resolved, but it seems like both are needed. We have to worry about the people at the top end, but we also have to worry about the entire labor force, because the nature of jobs in the US economy has changed dramatically and can be expected to change dramatically in the future.
To the extent that our population and the labor force is not able to adapt, which where I was going with that, that's kind of like the evolutionist looking at the adaptation of a species in its environment.
Okay, reckless. You have only 1 second here. Only 2 minutes. Let me find.
She's about to walk in the door.
AM.
Sorry, I tried to keep him in the study, but
No problem. He's doing fine. If you can give us like 2 more minutes. We need about 2 more minutes.
Come here, pup. Let's get some water. Come on, let's go.
These people are important.
This way.
He's got water in there.
That way.
Mine wasn't good, so I'll finish my question, and we can respond, and we'll get out of your afternoon.
No, I have one other thought to give you too that you might want. One of the things that we've found out over the last 30 years is that U.S. schools are not really competitive internationally. This surprises many Americans because we think we're best at everything. But when we, in fact, measure mathematics and science ability, particularly of U.S. students versus those in other countries, we find out that the U.S. students are rather mediocre. Now, people immediately say, if we're so mediocre, why do we do so well? Why is our economy growing so well? The fact is that many things contribute to economic well-being and the growth of the economy, and we have lots of advantages in the way we've organized our economy and the way we use the skills that we have. That does not deny that we wouldn't be better if we had better skills and more knowledge. If we could bring our students up to what I would call a middle-level European or middle or upper-level European level of knowledge, our economy would be predicted by past experiences to do much better than it is today. So much so that if we could get our students up to this high European level of knowledge, which is not the top in the world, but if we could get to that level, we could, in 25 or 30 years, pay for our entire level of kindergarten through 12th grade education with the added gains to our economy. Now, I said that in a very complicated way. If you want me to, if you think you want something like that, I can try it.
Take a minute, reflect, and give us that in this shorter jewel if you can.
Yeah, that's what I every once in a while I get off on one of these long checks. Our schools have not done particularly well compared to other schools in the world. We know, for example, that many European economies and many East Asian economies produce students that have much higher levels of mathematics and science knowledge than we have. We can relate performance of students to the future growth of the economy after we allow for the other differences in the economies. When we do that, we see that there are great economic advantages to improving the quality of our students. If we could move the typical US student up to the level of a high-level European school, we could expect much better growth out of the US economy. The added income to the US economy from moving to this European level could, in another 25 or 30 years, pay entirely for our kindergarten through 12th grade schooling. In other words, the growth dividend, the bonus that we got from higher quality schools, has huge implications for the well-being of society. Okay.
Yeah. Good. I so appreciate this. You come across great. I appreciate your crispness. It's going to help.
Well, thank you. I hope it helps.
I'm wrestling with, all right, well, how is it?